a verse function that works really rather well. I'm just going to go back and look at that for a second. I decided to do both the ordinal and the gifts as lists, which means that I can get the ordinal value by using its position. Because day is coming in based on 1 counting, I have to subtract 1. And I have to do the same with gifts. I have to subtract 1 from whichever one I'm working with. But I can get the ordinal value of the day by calling that. I could have just as easily made this into a, if I wanted, I could have said ordinal is equal to a dictionary, where I can go from the integer value 1 as a key, and I could have made this first. And I could have gone from 2 to second, and on for all 12. And that's a completely reasonable way to do that. If I did this, then I wouldn't have to subtract 1 from it. There's really no preferred method here, whichever one works for you. For the gifts, I could have also decided to make this into a dictionary, and I could have, for instance, made this 1 and then made it a partridge in a pear tree, and then done that. Now, the problem there is that I really wanted to do a list slicing in order to get all the gifts up to a particular day. So to me, making that into a list made a lot more sense. So whichever way you'd like to write that is fine. So I have a verse that works, but now the problem is in calling it that I'm still getting an extra new line here at the end, and I don't want that. I had suggested that, for instance, we could create verses as a list. So we can initialize a list here, and we could say verses dot append the verse for that day. And now at the end, we could print all the verses joined on 2 new lines. So we want 2 new lines in between them, so we could call that with verses. And now if I run this, I get 2 new lines in between each verse, but nothing, just 1 new line at the end, and that 1 new line is actually put there by print. So that's a good way to get around the problem that we saw before. If you actually print the verse here inside the for loop, then you have to decide if you're on the last day and not do that extra print. Really, that's a lot of extra effort to figure out when and when not to do that printing. I think it's a lot easier to create this as a list and then join all the verses together on 2 new lines at the end. If you had an extremely large list, like you were generating something like millions of verses, then it would be better to handle each verse inside of a for loop, print it, and then, it would definitely be worth the effort to figure out not to print that last new line. If you really were doing this, if you had to sing millions of verses, then you wouldn't want to allocate the memory for millions of verses to fit inside a list, and then at the end, deal with those million elements to print them out. So it just depends on the kind of problem that you're solving as to how you might go about using a data structure for that. One of the things here, though, is that whenever I see this pattern of initializing an empty list or an empty string and then somehow appending to it, I know that right away that's probably not the best way to write it. It's probably better to write that as a list comprehension. So I'm going to change this to verses, and I know it's going to be a list comprehension. It's still going to have this for loop. So if you want, you can put that in first. That's going to be the for loop. And here, instead of saying verses append, we don't have to say that part. We can just say verse.day for day in range. So if I comment this out and run this, it's going to produce the same output. Now, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I should have run make test. And so the idea here is that I'm testing, I'm making sure that it actually is working. And so we're seeing that 1, 2, and all the verses going to standard out are passing, but it's failing here for, actually I know it's for writing an output file. So we're going to deal with that next, and then we'll come talk about refactoring and writing this in different ways.